Okay, hello YouTube, Jacob here. Today am wanting to explain something that I find very interesting. So, I am fascinated by the concept of liberalism as a political ideology. So, for me, liberalism is endlessly contradictory because it encompasses so many different ideas at different points. A modern day liberal would favor more government use in the economy. 200 years ago, that was the exact opposite. But we still used this specific term to mean a specific ideology and how we use it. And for me, I think that's a very interesting ideology to explore. And the best way that I like to explore it a lot of the time in my own head is by talking about history. I think using history to ground these ideas can both expose its weaknesses, its strength, its contradictions, and see how it changes over time. And for me, one of my favorite eras in American history in the 1960s. And I'm going to get into why I find it interesting, and I think it's a very interesting thing to evaluate liberalism in this time period. So I want to go through a lot of the events of the 1960s, what happened, why is it so fascinating, tell a compelling story, but simultaneously, I want this thread of what is a liberal and how did this connect back to what we're talking about at different points to be something that promulgates in your head, because I think a lot of history that we deal with today doesn't really deal with the ideology as much as it deals with the events. And I want that concurrent thought in your head of how this affecting the ideology. So I want to start here by just showing off where we start. The 1950s, before the 1960s. So this is kind of our idealized version of the 1950s. I'm going to delve a little bit more deeper into that aspect of the 1950s a little bit later, but we'll get there. This is how most Americans view themselves at this time. Nice family, nice house, clean, buttoned up, religious, good society. Everybody feels very socially conservative. Women still stay in the house, but it's not a very nothing is really changing. But you're starting to see movements starting to develop in the 1950s. MLK is arrested at multiple points. The South is starting to have to deal with these problems. But ultimately, our view of the 1950s at this golden era where we're very socially conservative, religious, well, nice, everything is clean and nice, is kind of how our view of the 1950s. I don't necessarily believe that to be fully true, but it's how Americans kind of view themselves at that point. And then we get to the election of JFK in 1960. So 1960 is a super close election. Either candidate could have won. JFK was a bit more charismatic, ultimately pulled it off, beat Richard Nixon. He's a character we'll get back to. And in the early 1960s, things seem very positive. We have major victories in the Cold War. The economy is booming. Things are going very well. JFK is super popular. Most people in the country feel like things are going very well. Now, the first major event that we kind of have to deal with in the 1960s that hurts this view is the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But personally, I don't really like to focus on this as much in the narrative of the 1960s because while it is fascinating to just see somebody so beloved and well liked just get suddenly shot like that, I don't think it affects where our narrative is going forward. But things are generally positive. You're beginning to see civil rights are being spread for African Americans. Everything is going really well in the early 1960s. Civil rights really is the dominant issue going into the 1964 election. We've had some victories in the Cold War. We've been fighting over it. Things are going very well, and it resounds to Lyndon B. Johnson defeating Barry Goldwater in arguably, depending on how you count it, the biggest landslide in American history. In the two-party race, he had the most biggest percentage of the popular vote of any candidate. He wins every single state outside of Arizona and the Deep South. Wins an insane victory, Democrats hold like 2/3 majorities in both houses of Congress. Um, as you can see, like, he really does win everything here. And at this point, I would say, it is very clear to me, and it feels to me, that liberalism is the dominant ideology in America. Civil rights are being expanded for Black Americans, women. Discrimination is being outlawed, which I associate heavily with the ideal of liberalism. And society is really changing. And one of the ways we can see it changing is in the hippie movement. So, famously, they would smoke weed, acid, all the time. They weren't working as much, but they were very free love. The sexual revolution occurred. Women are more open and out in society as opposed to being alone in the house, which is a very big change for society at this point. But this is where some of our ideological contradictions begin to emerge. So, with our freedom in society, a lot of new concurrents start to show up that didn't really show up. And I am gonna start here. So, this is an image of the Black Panther movement. So, one of the contradictions of the 1960s is both that civil rights was extremely prominent, but very radical Black nationalist movements, such as the Black Panthers, who believed in things such as arming themselves and were very violent towards the average American, began to emerge. Our liberal framework that allowed civil rights to really come into being in America, at the same time used more radical groups, such as the Black Panthers here, who believed in violence, using our liberal framework to expand rights to Black Americans. Some people took it further and said we should reject a liberal tradition of freedom and instead have a more violent sect in order to promote our ideals of Black freedom or nationalism. But I feel as though, personally, more violent movements such as this don't fit into our liberal framework and ultimately invites backlash, but that's personally me. But we're beginning to see a lot of more slow societal decay. Black nationalist movements like this are not even super common compared to the civil rights movement. They're less than like 10% of the movement. Hippies are prominent in the country, but most of them are just young people looking to have a fun time, and they eventually grow out of it. But these smaller things are starting to emerge in America and really kind of beginning to have a little bit of a backlash occur to them later on. And in my opinion, our liberal ideas that we had really allowed these new concurrents to emerge that were also somewhat anti-liberal. And I want to do a little bit of a backtrack to talk about our major characters going forward, because I think these are some of the most interesting characters. So here, LBJ, our president. So JFK was assassinated in 1963. He took over. So LBJ grew up in deep poverty, poor, black, backbreaking labor, as horrible as it can be in our time. Like, something we can't really physically imagine being the average experience in America, but it was very common in his day. He grew up very poor, and he sought out to really stop that in a lot of ways. But he was a man of many contradictions. So he was a man obsessed, because of his experiences, he became obsessed with power and trying to promote it to make sure that his experiences never happened again. But he would use corrupt tactics. For example, he would use ballot stuffing in order to win close elections. He would bully senators into voting his way to protect civil rights. He was a man who ultimately wanted good things to happen, but looked down upon people who were handed things. Where, for example, the Kennedys, as grew up wealthy, it supported a lot of the same things he did, but he felt like he fought for them. It didn't like the Kennedys for that. Ultimately, I think I'm painting a little bit of too rosy of a picture of him, because he would use things like he would tell racist senators like, oh, I'm on your side, I support, like, say the N word all the time. It's a means of trying to convince them that he was one of them when he ultimately wasn't. And he was a series of contradictions in a lot of ways, where he was obsessed with power but using it for the common good. And I just think that's a very fascinating narrative about this character that really embodies the 1960s in a lot of ways. So here we got him, or Tricky Dick, one of the most fascinating, probably my favorite like character in history, in my opinion, just because he's so interesting. Okay, so he grew up also extremely poor, like nothing was going well. Um, his I read a book on Nixon and it said this line. I think it's very interesting. He grew up with a mother who thought he was going to be president of the United States one day, and a father he was never good enough for. So he spent his entire life trying to be the best at literally everything. And he kind of grew up with a chip on his shoulder. So, for example, he got into Harvard, which is still not crazy difficult at that time, but still an accomplishment. But had to turn it down for financial reasons and went to a worse college because of it. He kind of grew up feeling like he was not in with these fancy institutions like the Kennedy family and stuff like that. He kind of felt very resented for not being allowed to do that, and kind of had a little bit of a backlash in his view to the elites of society that he felt like he had. And he really became a person who hated losing and hated our media institutions and our financial institutions and anybody who he viewed as being in charge of this country. Because he grew up not being allowed to enter these places and always feeling sidelined by them. And he lost famously. He lost the 1960 election, lost in 1962, but he positioned himself well and gets renominated for the 1968 election. And next, I'm going to talk about one more character, RFK. So, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was the younger brother of John F. Kennedy. He was his attorney general. He kind of worked with him on everything throughout his entire career early on. He was a lot more of a conservative figure when he was younger. For example, he was extremely hawkish in the Cold War. While working as attorney general, he wiretapped MLK to spy on him. But after the assassination of JFK, he really did change as a person. So he began really empathizing with the downtrodden in society in a very genuine, real way that he hadn't really earlier in his life. And in the 1968 primary, stuff like the black Americans overwhelmingly support him in the primary, for example, as opposed to upper class, rich, white people who, like, he supported his brother beforehand. He was very prominent. He had a major character transformation throughout 1968, or I guess from 1963 to 1968. We already talked about that. I'm a little bit disorganized. Okay. So, we go into 1968. We have a lot of concurrent movements that are building up. We have the black nationalists are starting to become a lot more prominent during this time period, where people are kind of scared of these outside groups creating violence. But the big one that I have not talked about yet is Vietnam. So, Vietnam is a small country in Southeast Asia. Most Americans probably don't even know where it is. And there's a draft going on that are sending a lot of Americans over to Vietnam to fight in this war that's killing a lot of Americans, a lot of people. And there's this huge anti-Vietnam War movement. So people are like protesting all over this country, but it's really associated with the far left in the country, where like you'll have incidents, for example, where soldiers will come home and like they'll individual members of these movements will attack them and feel hostility from them and blame these individual soldiers, and it really feels like a society that's not really supporting what it once stood for. to where a lot of these ideas are creating too many freedoms for people to protest, and it really gets lumped in with this Vietnam War movement. So today we all kind of view Vietnam as, oh, war was a problem. We don't like the fact that we went to war and it was bad. But for a lot of Americans at the time, it wasn't even about the Vietnam War. It was about who was against it mostly. And the people who were against the Vietnam War were people who were very radical in their politics, even by today's standard. We don't see black nationalist groups running around anymore, for example, but a lot of these radical ideas were really there. So Richard Nixon comes back to the stage, and he had this big tough on crime narrative. We're going to stop these dope smokers, the hippies, and all these people who are against the Vietnam War, but a lot of it's on a cultural level more so than a policy level. And then LBJ starts running in the primary. LBJ with the president, he starts losing, showing his vulnerability, and he announces that he is not going to be running for re-election. So RFK manages to come in because LBJ is not running, and they figure out, okay, who is going to be our nominee for president? And then we get one of the saddest moments, a very sad moment in American history, is when MLK is assassinated during the race. So MLK are famous, like, he was assassinated by a white supremacist. And at this point, you can really see the country starting to tear itself apart a lot. So a lot of these movements are driving radicalism. The conservatives are coming back with Richard Nixon saying, we're going to crack down on these hippies and all that stuff. And the liberal left at this time is fracturing too, where they are struggling to really come up with coherent arguments, A, against these radical movements, but at the same time, B, against the conservatives, because everyone's either viewing themselves through a radical position or through a conservative position. Really, liberalism is starting to really fracture because there isn't a coherent argument of people are struggling to find a coherent argument between why, if I'm supporting black people, why am I not supporting these armed Black Panther groups, for example, but they're at the same time not really supporting, or there's like, if I don't support them, I should support Richard Nixon, who wants to stop these groups from happening. There isn't really people trying to find a healthy middle ground anymore between radical ideologies, which is what I view liberalism as. And I got a little bit sidetracked. So we got to the MLK assassination, and I want to play for you one of my favorite speeches in American history. So this is RFK's speech after MLK was assassinated, and I really just want to play this speech mostly because I think it's a really good speech. I think not enough people have heard it, and I really think it summarizes where we are as a country at that point and where we should go from then on. So I'll play that real quick.
Do they know about Martin Luther King?
We have left it up beyond the that can be handled.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks, and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. And he once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And what dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
Okay, so there's the speech. Now, the sad thing that I think really undercuts the 1968 election is liberalism had a shot at winning with RFK in my mind, but RFK was assassinated that election cycle too by somebody not even fighting for a liberal or conservative cause, by somebody who's fighting for a Palestinian national movement, which RFK wasn't his biggest concern with. RFK is assassinated, and liberalism really struggles to find a foothold in America. So Richard Nixon wins in 1968. And liberalism really doesn't really find its place again for really ever in American history. It takes a long time for a Democrat to even be elected president. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit, but for the next 24 years, one Democrat wins wins the presidency. 4 of the next 24 years, Republicans are in charge. The next Democrat after that moderates by going towards the center and acting like a Republican in a lot of ways with Bill Clinton. And Jimmy Carter was barely won, and he was ridiculously unpopular his whole term. Liberalism really didn't have a place in America at that point as the coherent, dominant ideology that we had at that point. But now something I want to go back to that I find really interesting is the 1950s. So I said I'd go back to it. One thing that I like reflecting on the 1950s is the myth and narrative around the perfect family that we had then wasn't necessarily true. Domestic abuse between spouses was very common. Women were miserable at that time living in the house. Houses back then were tiny. People lived in very small. There was no air conditioning. Life expectancy wasn't very good. Most families barely owned one car. Like, what we view today as the 1950s, and even back then, the way they viewed themselves, is kind of a myth. To where how nice it was even back then wasn't true. But I like to think that sometimes that myth also held together society. And in the 1960s, really just kind of nothing really changed in a lot of ways, but a lot of the exposed a lot of what was actually underneath the surface and how people were really feeling. With, like, for example, the sexual revolution, civil rights, all those things people were feeling, it just wasn't prominent yet and had to be exposed out into the open. So I want to go narrative-wise. I'll go really quick with the rest of this. So throughout the beginning of the 1970s, Richard Nixon is now the president. The country is still in chaos, but conservatism really does become the dominant ideology. So 1972, the Democrats elect a very liberal person for their nomination, and they lose in a landslide. And I mean, let me just show you the 1964 map. 1964 to 1972. It's quite a contrast. He wins every state except for Massachusetts and D.C. In a lot of ways, conservatism just has been the dominant ideology in America since. And liberalism really has fallen. Okay, I just want to explain a little bit about Richard Nixon because I think he's so interesting. Nixon, because he's so focused on these tough on crime narrative, he becomes really paranoid about all these institutions and people coming out to get him, the deep state's gonna get me, and all that stuff. He ends up, some of his people who worked under him went to the Watergate Hotel where the DNC was, stole a lot of their documents, and Nixon uses his powers to try to cover it up. That's Watergate in a nutshell. And Nixon has to resign. But at this point, like, liberalism hadn't really survived as an ideology, and it really doesn't ever really take hold in America in the same way that it was. I mean, it was briefly tried in the 1960s, and it was our dominant strain for a long time of slow, gradual reform. And that period of society changing really hurt it and helped in some way. So I've been kind of dour. I'm a liberal. I've been kind of dour on the 1960s in a lot of ways. So I want to explain some positives. So first off, civil rights, like, the best thing that America has done in modern history. You know, like, without civil rights, it'd be insane to think what country would be today. And our society, like, the sexual revolution and our social change that we've had has really been of such positives and has really been, like, an incredible thing for our country. But at the same time, our spirit of reform and liberal ideology has really not come back since the 1960s. I just want to, like, an example. Like, in the 1988 election, George Bush would call Michael Dukakis a liberal every time he could, because it just was, like, such a, because liberal was a bad word in politics. So I just wanted to summarize this video and explain, like, liberalism at its core is an ideology that can have a lot of freedoms associated with it. But the reform, what happened in the 1960s, permanently hurt it. And I think it's an interesting story why. So, I think you got the video. I think this is interesting. I'd like to do this again for, like, I don't know, a different time, because I think liberalism is just a fun thing to evaluate at different points in history. So, yeah, that's my video. Thank you. Have a good one.